Security is a dynamic concept which requires application from different perspectives. From physical, data and asset safety and security, there are various tools, techniques and inferences which are involved in the designing and evolution of its best practices. Security continues to be viewed as a luxury rather than a necessity for business processes. In the physical security segment, there are over 5 million private security guards available as compared to 3.2 million police officers. The influx of several modern-day building complexes for multinational companies has resulted in futuristic security design trends being introduced. The same models for security designing are applicable to the smart cities projects. Experts weighed in on the need for security designing for smart cities.
Smart cities must include basics like complete video surveillance, GPS tracking of the public transport, privacy of data, for that matter an emergency response system by air. These are the minimum requirements of a smart city, I think. And if we can train the citizens on basic security and safety measures, that is an added advantage.
This episode takes forward the role and scope of the security designing for major infrastructure and how the Indian property developers and their end users are likely to be impacted from this.
Hello and welcome to another episode of IIRIS Report. And in this particular episode, we are going to look at India's urban security challenges and what India needs to do with its smart city agenda, more specifically with the government's introduction of the concept of smart cities. The implementation of large-scale projects in the directions have brought about a debate that are we really up to it? Are we investing the kind of money that we need to invest to make the smart city concept a real success? And most importantly, the subject of security within smart city is an issue that has many challenges and has not found a consensus in the form of answers. And to look at the subject in greater detail, we have two experts who have been both professionally involved with the business of urban planning and security in smart cities or in urban areas. We have Mr. Sanjay Singh, a director with ARCOP, an architectural design company, which looks extensively at issues related with urban designing and planning. And we have Mr. Kunal Bhogal, who is a principal consultant with IIRIS, a company that looks at a range of security parameters. So, Kunal, I'll go to you first. Now, the question that has been coming to my mind is, there is, and I've watched it very carefully for some years now, that there is a need for the government to change its approach to security. Because security seems to be, as long as you guard government installations and VIPs and provide protection to governmental agencies and people, you seem to have done enough. But a large number of our taxpayers are not getting the kind of security they have. So there are 2-3 fallouts. One is that alternate mechanisms of security have come into being, most of them not up to scratch private security agencies. Some are going a step further and satisfying with themselves by putting CCTV all over the place. But CCTV in itself just gives you an after impact report. How do you prevent it from happening in the first place? So what's your take?
So thank you for the question. My take would be the concept of security needs to be knitted into the social fabric of the country. Security is no more a luxury. It's a prime requirement of our daily livelihoods. And though both government and the private sector have done their bit to upgrade the security infrastructure and do their best to safeguard our interests, but a lot needs to be done on a grassroots level. A lot needs to be done in terms of educating people why security.
Specify what needs to be done at the grassroots level.
We should start with talking about security in schools and colleges. We should start talking about the need for security.
Public awareness, essentially. I know something that in the UK they follow something called Plan Griffin, which basically means that every standard operating procedure that the police is to implement, they involve the citizens in that. So there is a complete consensus. But here, unfortunately, between the government and the citizens, there is always this big wall that, only they have the right to feel nationalistic about things, and other citizens are not necessarily, their views are not taken into account. So how do you create this intermix between the government and the private sector and the public so that a more comprehensive approach to security is evolved?
I think a lot has to be given to the government as well, the way they go out in the public domain to talk about these issues. I think by the right channels like media, the right channels like print media, wherein they can talk about the primordial need for security in all aspects of life, industry, private life, infrastructure, urban infrastructure, and also specifically how do you safeguard your interests? How do you safeguard yourself in the normal walks of life? I think there's been a lot of effort that has been made by the government, made by law enforcement agencies to talk about security infrastructure, to talk about behavioral aspects to security. But I think a lot needs to be done. There is still scope for a lot of follow-on.
Sanjay, my understanding is that even when the government reaches out, they reach out to a lot of people through the various arms of the government,
right,
who are not necessarily the kind of people that maybe you as an architectural planner would be dealing with.
Right.
You would be dealing with maybe upper middle and upper income groups, which are already conscious of the need for security because it impacts their life, it impacts their businesses, it impacts their engagement with the rest of the world. So how do we, because you see, one of the findings is that the government has only allocated $1.2 billion for the smart cities budget in 2014-15. I'm assuming it would have gone up a bit, so make it $1.5 billion.
Right.
But that's also not great money for a country of India's size, considering the fact that smart cities are there are already smart cities of sorts. Only thing is they're not that well planned. Even new cities that come up, I can give you the example of Gurgaon.
Right.
It's not planned because one sector is one place, sector 40 is somewhere, and next to it adjoining is probably sector 25 or 29 or something, and so you really, unlike Chandigarh or Bhubaneswar, these cities have come up. I don't know who did the planning, but the planning is not right. There are not enough footpaths for people to walk on. There are not enough spaces where people can feel secure, and there are not enough technologies, which I feel is a huge force multiplier to make smart cities effective, not being used. So where do we begin? Because I think it's good to use these fancy terminologies, but I have been given to understand through fairly reliable sources that when you are looking at a partnership with the Americans on smart city programs for some of your 2-3 cities like Ahmedabad, Ajmer, Varanasi and others, they have been coming again and again, and I think where we fall short everywhere in drawing foreign involvement and investment, we don't have plans in place.
That's correct. So I think you've touched a very important point. When you took the example of Gurgaon, let's just look at it generically. Okay, when you talk about security, the way the world sees it. Okay, I'm aware of a group which is called the Association of Civil Engineers in America, the American Civil Engineers Association, which post 9/11, they realized that while all the government buildings have the plans in place, have the codal requirements in place of how the security has to be, sort of brought in, but for all other building typologies, it was missing. And the government is able to actually protect its buildings in a much more efficient manner because they have those.
In the US.
In the US, I'm talking about. When you take this, aspect to India, you'll be surprised to know that the National Building Code, which got revised in as early as February 2017, talks about all kind of threats to the buildings and to the urban places, including fire, which is on top priority. But there is absolutely no mention of the word security anywhere in the code. That talks about that there is no uniform system of approaching this whole planning.
Or is it because the different agencies of the government deal with different things, and security is an area which people don't want to get into? I mean, that's a home ministry sort of domain.
That is true so far as the other aspects also are concerned. There are various ministries various departments which are involved. But I think the realization that security is an inherent requirement of the urban built form.
You know, I know
has not
somebody,
crept in.
I know somebody, a top security expert in the UK, and a top British construction company, can't take names, have hired him. You know, he's a globally recognized figure. And what he does is, he builds security in with the plans of the building from day one, so that you don't create a building and then suddenly decide, where do I put my cameras or whatever else. So he starts doing it from, is that happening? Is that awareness there?
So that's the point I was making, that, you know, the key word is early on. Okay, we always talk about when the security comes in early on in the architectural program or the urban program, it is very easy to integrate it with the overall system, whereas it actually comes much later. It comes as an afterthought. And probably the reasons that could be is that there are no, you know, mandatory codal requirements. So most of the people miss it.
So how do we, Kunal, how do we get greater awareness about security in buildings? For instance, what can lead to secure designs? What can the government do to ensure this? I mean, since you are a great advocate that government is doing everything right, now what can the government do this in this case?
So government, for the time being, government has certain guidelines in silos for various industries. Okay, a lot of these guidelines, they need constant revision. And these guidelines also have to be knitted together with the demographics and the social fabric of that place where the building is coming. That is one. I'm just going to go back to what Sanjay said about, you know, knitting security and safety when a building is upcoming. It all starts from the grassroots level. And security is not about technology. It's about the entire foundation of the development. It is about the environment around the development. It's about traffic. It's about demographics. It's about the aging infrastructure. Security is a primary part of all of that. So what government should do is first look at whatever is running silos. Government should be able to integrate all of that together. The way to do it is, of course, you know, NBCI, the National Building Code was actually a great initiative. But I've seen 2 iterations of that and even the late one does not have any dedicated chapter on security. So I think that's a good start.
Okay, so very interesting points raised, and we will be looking at some of the issues concerning how to involve the public more, how to have greater engagement with all sections of society, including the building fraternity and the technology providers, in making India and its smart cities more safe and secure to begin with, and eventually make all of India secure. But that after a break. Welcome back. We are continuing to look at the challenges for urban modernization, particularly the smart city projects, and we continue to have our 2 experts with us. So I go back to you, Sanjay. I mean, the point that Kunal was making is that we do it from scratch, we build everything up. But I think there is another issue that needs to be that how do you create this awareness amongst the building fraternity, who are not the most liked people in the country at this point of time, the builders? How do you create awareness amongst them कि security is something you might like to give short shrift to? And I'm not talking of only residential areas. I'm talking of businesses and industrial areas. Let me highlight one quick point. Before doing the 26/11 attacks, David Headley, that did a reconnaissance of various cities in India, he identified the buildings that were secure, appeared secure, as against buildings that appeared not so secure, and therefore they were targeted. So how do you ensure that facade of security is done, but at the same time that a lot of, in the hotel industry, for instance, a lot of hotels were, and maybe some of them are still notorious for having a very secure front and checking your cars and all when it goes in, but the backdoor entry for all the logistics supplier is an open gate.
Right. So I think an important point, and let's understand this like this, that, you know, wherever crime happens, you know, the people who do the crime, they don't want to be seen. And so that brings you to a very interesting concept which is called eye on the street. Okay. And when we say how do we sort of bring the builder community to adopt security, I think mere codal requirements or mere lip service is not going to happen. So you have to incentivize it in some way. And I think this eye on the street concept is something which could be path breaking. It's been also codified by the DDA on their transit oriented development, which are the developments are happening around the metro. So what this does is, it creates, instead of boundary walls, which create deserted locations outside and which lead to the cases like Nirbhaya, it allows you to do a zero setback. So you bring in your buildings right up to the street and you create a retail there. That's an incentive to the developer. And what it does in the process is that all the daytime till 9 o'clock in the evening, you have the retail which keeps an eye on the street. There are lights, so people cannot do any kind of crime related activities. And in the evening, the buildings which are inside are oriented in a manner that they can keep an eye on the street. So I think that's somewhere where the codal requirements, the incentivization, and the way we are looking at planning as a whole can sort of come in and address this issue.
Right, good. Kunal, I want to shift a bit to another issue, and that is, I think, very important, that, people in India always deliver when there's some kind of a sword on their head. Now, the need for regulation and the need for a regulatory framework is essential. Now, apparently post-liberalization of the Indian economy from 1991 onwards, a large number of foreign companies began to try and do business in India. But one of the things they found that in Indian cities, that there was not enough required compliance and not enough regulatory frameworks to get them to require. So how do you quickly put that in place? Because I think that same story still persists.
So I think with the proliferation of corporate India and the economy booming, there was more foreign investment coming from outside, the more corporates coming into India. They want to have the same standards that they have in their home countries as what they have here in India. And that is what has been primarily pushing the requirement of compliance. At the same time, our economy and our social fabric, our demographics are also changing. So the compliant requirements actually go vice versa as well. And you will see more infrastructure also strengthening the requirements of compliance. So I think it's a hand in hand thing between compliance and what you require on the ground. And I think this is only good for everybody.
Sanjay, he talked of demographics. Let me bring some facts across to you. 25 to 30 people migrate every minute to a major Indian city. We are expected to have a population by 2050, that's 33 years away, of 843 million people in Indian cities. I mean, this is some calculation somebody's come up with. Whereas only much smaller percentage of India will be left in rural areas. However, worldwide, our figures are not that bad, considering everywhere people are moving. They said eventually something like 10% of the world's Earth's surface will only be urbanized. So how do you shift the focus from current urban areas to not urban areas and hold back this onslaught of population? Because that is, whatever good measures you put into place, you're going to have a problem. I mean, people who come from Scandinavia for the first time in Indian cities like Delhi or Bombay, they're just in a state of shock. There's just so many people, and we still sort of muddle our way through it. But how do you decongest the cities in an effort that your good work in planning holds up?
Absolutely. So I think the numbers that we are dealing with, they will put, and they can put, they have the potential to put all kind of plannings into a tailspin. You may design your cities for any kind of numbers, but if these numbers are going to be unstoppable, like you said, migration from rural areas to urban areas, nothing is going to hold. How far can you spread the urban areas? So I think it takes you actually to a different point that, the economic growth of the country is right now, concentrated at fewer locations. I think this has to become more broad-based. The planning, alone will not be an answer to this. It'll have to be the push on the economic front.
I want to interject here with a small question.
Sure.
So do you think an idea of building a smart city alongside a city that already exists is not such a good idea? Because if you were to put it away by 5 or 10 kilometers away, where it would still have linkages, I mean, look at Delhi NCR, the NCR region All of it is 10 to 15 kilometers away from main Delhi itself, or maybe more. But they are thriving. So why do you need to have a smart city adjoining a city that already exists, and it's impossible to convert either of the two into a happy situation?
I think absolutely. I think the answer lies in the term itself. A smart city need not be physically, next to a already existing city. Smart city should be able to communicate and, do the business seamlessly and create opportunities in a seamless manner, even at a remoter location. This is what happens, all across the globe. US is a perfect example. Not everything is happening in New York or New Jersey. There are centers which are, located, 50 miles away, but the infrastructure is good. Their connected physical infrastructure as well as IT infrastructure is all good. All the amenities and facilities that are required are within, the strikeable distance of that establishment. So people don't want to move. People are very happy where they are. Because
so, we could certainly, learn a lesson or two, not just from the US, but other Western countries also.
Absolutely.
And I think that way, to that extent, maybe the government's decision to sort of go and engage with the US with the Smart Cities program primarily seems to be a good idea.
Seems to be a good idea.
But Kunal, another question to you. Now, since you look at security and risk management and all that stuff, the general complaint about Indian security, and this is not about smart cities or urban centers, it's right across the board, that our security approach has always been reactive, not proactive. How do you make it proactive and not just reactive?
So, see, we have been spending a lot of money in putting up security infrastructure over a period of time. Government, the private sector, even citizens have been putting a lot of money to put up, rings and rings of security. What all of this is doing is, it is producing a lot of data, but it is not giving you the required knowledge. So first and foremost, we have to shift our orientation towards a more knowledge-oriented security management, or shall I say, knowledge-oriented security setup. One is this. Second is that we have to have not just the right infrastructure, city-level infrastructure in place, but also a thought process of managing disasters, thought process of managing emergencies, and more in a very collective way. When I say collective, the citizens are only one part of it. The law enforcement is quite another. And then we have dedicated personnel, or we have dedicated groups in the public domain who can cater for this. So the entire response has to come collectively, and that's what will make it proactive. The proactive is all about having the right amount of knowledge and reacting in the right time manner.
Right. Sanjay, again, a question straight up your street. You deal a lot with the private sector. And the private sector, what has been their role in contributing to the actual implementation of smart cities or urbanization? Or, it's one thing to sit in your glass offices and complain the government isn't doing enough. And I've paid my taxes and the government should do everything. But I think you need to go a step further. I have always advocated that big business, some business houses dedicate anything up to 3%, some hotel groups, in the upkeep and maintenance of the hotel infrastructure, because that's what's going to continue to enhance the business. What stops the private sector from actually making an investment of 1% of their profits towards security compliance in the areas that really concern them? And this is not just where the CEOs live, it's not just the fancy offices, it's the whole supply chain.
Yes, you're right. And I think the answer probably lies in one of your earlier questions, where you said, why are we reactive and why are we not proactive? That is because, security, if you look at the, total budget for, securing a complex, I don't think it'll cross more than 2 to 3%. But since there is no return on investment, so they try to shirk away from it, okay? And I think it is the end consumer, especially in today's market.
But the return on investment is their life.
Absolutely. But, if something happens, then they realize. Till it hasn't happened, they don't realize. So I think in today's market, there's a great opportunity, because the real estate market is down. The consumer has become the king today. The developers, are approaching them. It's not a seller's market, it's a buyer's market. So I think it's this group, consumer group, which can now start demanding. You have to demand these services as not as additionals or as extras. You have to demand it as a basic package.
Right.
And I think once you start doing that, once they start realizing that it's not going without it, it'll start coming in.
Right. So some very important points have been raised in terms of urban security, the challenges and how we should respond, both at the level of the consumer, the public, and most importantly, the private sector, because one of the assertions by one of our experts is the government is already doing quite a bit to create awareness. But more than awareness, we now have to move to the next stage of urban security in at least our smart city initiatives to ensure that India provides the right picture to the world to come and invest more, and India provides the right climate and the right environment for foreign investors to feel secure that this is the country to put your money in future. Thank you very much for being with us on the show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for watching and goodbye.